Geoeconomics represents the latest development or turn in realist international political economy. It's important to note how geoeconomics refer both to a strategic practice as well as an analytical framework. As a strategic practice, geoeconomics refers to power politics by economic means, so the way states drive their geostrategic aims by economic instruments and by way of economic policymaking. As a strategic practice, geoeconomics differs then from geopolitics, which centers around the use of military means and military power. As an analytical framework then, geoeconomics is interested in the strategic uses of economic power, for instance in how states use economic sanctions to accomplish strategic goals, or alternatively how they use economic inducements, economic carrots, to accomplish strategic goals. The geo in geoeconomics refers to the way geography conditions economic power politics. On the one hand, economic power and capabilities has geographical dimensions. Economic resources, economic links, and networks usually underpin economic power. We may think of energy resources such as oil, which are geographical in the sense of being located somewhere or spatially patterned in a way that enables their use for power political purposes. More broadly, the geo in geoeconomics refer to the geography of global flows, such as goods, capital, resources, and data, around which much economic politics revolve. The way countries are linked to these global flows, how dependent they are of particular flows, or how much control they have of those flows will condition their geoeconomic strategies and ability to wield economic power for strategic purposes. On the other hand, the geo then also refers to the way economic means and control of these global economic flows can be used to control specific geographical areas through attempts to maintain spheres of influence. We may think of the way Russia, through its control of natural gas flows to Europe, has been able to wield influence in Europe, and how it has put Europe, and especially perhaps Germany, in a very difficult bind as it now struggles to wean itself off this dependence on Russian gas exports. Or we may think of the way China has come to control not only the extraction of rare earth minerals, critical for the production of batteries used in electric vehicles and for the green energy transition in general, how it not only controls extraction sites, meaning mining sites around the world, but also production sites and supply lines, and how that gives China strategic leverage over other countries that are dependent on these critical minerals, and how that dependence gives China the sort of possibility to extract concessions perhaps from these countries that are dependent on these minerals that China controls. It gives China political leverage, potential political leverage that it can be used. The EU, which has set very ambitious goals for its green transition and its digital transition, is sort of a hostage, perhaps, at least from an economic realist perspective, to the China's control of these critical minerals. In true economic realist fashion, then, the geoeconomic perspective focuses on how economic interdependencies can be manipulated for strategic gain, how states try to derive power from interdependence by making other states dependent on themselves and then use those dependence to their own advantage. Geoeconomics sees the interdependent structure of the international economic system as largely asymmetric, meaning that some states are more dependent than others. They even think that there's an inherent tendency of interdependence to become more asymmetric over time, that networks in general have a tendency of becoming more hierarchical over time because of different reasons, such as returns to scale and the ability of the strongest actors to shut out others or weaker actors, or buy up other weaker actors. So geoeconomics very much looks at this asymmetric interdependency of the international system, thinks it's accelerating, that there's a tendency to more asymmetry in the national system, and that this is something that states revolve their politics around. They want to use these interdependencies and manipulate them. So power then resides in this perspective, in this asymmetric interdependent character of our international system. And geoeconomics is interested in how that power is being used. Importantly, however, to understand how economic power is being wielded, geoeconomics also looks to domestic politics, the internal dimension of the nation state, especially the way state-business relations conditions geoeconomic statecraft, because firms are the most important, assumed to be the most important interlocutors for state action in the economic domain. The state needs to mobilize corporations for its own geoeconomic strategies, and depending on the nature of state-business relations, that may be easier in some cases than others. And businesses also have agency of their own and are not always willing to play along with the state, especially big firms in market capitalist systems. Think of Amazon or big banks who have a lot of capital and a lot of production sites. They may be able to contest the state's plans. They may be able to go against the state in many ways, or they might use democratic infrastructure to contest the state plans and its geoeconomic strategies. This may be very different in state capitalist systems or authoritarian systems, where the state might be able to wield much more control over its big corporation, its firms. So there's the big question in geoeconomics also. It's sort of a comparative, to compare different systems and how well one system might be able to mobilize mobilize corporate actors for their geoeconomic statecraft. That's one thing that are being researched as we speak. Corporate geoeconomics is then sort of a recent field of study, in which analysts and scholars specifically look into the way this relationship between state and businesses is playing out and to what effects. As a field of study then, geoeconomics is very practice-oriented. It looks at the way states and corporations go about using economic power for strategic ends, how economic policymaking is being applied as a means of foreign policy. Examples include Russia's energy politics. Scholars of geoeconomics have, for instance, shown how Russia has been using its energy resources, its control over especially natural gas, as a sort of what has been called a wedge strategy in Europe. So by giving very favorable, lucrative contracts, natural gas contracts, to some actors in Europe and some countries in Europe, Russia has been able to bind up those countries, make those actors more dependent on Russia. Whereas on the other hand, Russia has been closing off the gas pipe from other countries or giving very bad contracts to other actors in Europe. And through that, Russia has been able to drive a wedge through Europe, make these actors have very different interests, diversified, differing interests in relation to Russia. And so the common sort of Russia line has been undermined in Europe. And Europe has had problems getting together its own European Union its own energy union. This is one example of how geoeconomics as a strategic practice can be used, at least as looked from the point of view of geoeconomic analysis. China's infrastructure politics can also be understood from a geoeconomic perspective. Through loans, investments, these big infrastructure projects that go under the sort of umbrella name of the Belt and Road Initiative, China has been, according to these geoeconomic analysts, binding up other countries to itself, making other countries dependent on China. And through that, China has been able to gain a lot of political influence in these countries. It's claimed that China has been able to get these countries also to, according to some studies, to vote with China and to downplay perhaps earlier criticism of the Chinese human rights record. So This has been a sort of a geoeconomic binding strategy that, according to some geoeconomic analysis, China has been undertaking for the last 10 or 20 years in order to lift itself up to global powerhood, but not by traditional geopolitical or military means, but very smart geoeconomic means, by using its economic power as a basis for creating this sort of hub and spoke system with China in the middle. A third example that geoeconomic analysis has been looking at is the way Arab states, such as Qatar, is granting aid and loans to other countries, and how this can be understood as a form of checkbook diplomacy, or what has been called checkbook diplomacy. So by granting this aid and loans to other countries, Qatar sort of buys influence into these countries, makes itself heard on the international stage, and gains a position. That's a very sort of traditional way of using economic power as a basis for a buying foreign policy influence. We can then also think of how the EU, even EU enlargement, can be understood as a geoeconomic inducement strategy, or a sort of a similar way as China has been binding other countries up to itself. EU has been offering to open up its markets, its economic markets, to countries bordering the EU, and those countries then have been attracted by EU markets, and through that has also then committed themselves to certain political goals and political rules and norms that the EU is demanding of countries tying up to the EU in exchange for becoming members. So that's sort of a geoeconomic binding strategy that geoeconomic analysis has recently been focusing on. Last, we can think of the way US uses sanctions. That's another way of geoeconomics in practice, and the way US uses its financial sanctions in particular to demand, to drive its strategic goals in many parts of the world and demand accessions from other countries. That's also a traditional way, of course, of economic statecraft, but that has been much more topical as sanctions have become a more prominent instrument and come almost into the center of US foreign and security policy making. So these are some of the examples of recent geoeconomic analysis and geoeconomic research, which is very much a burgeoning field of study within realist international political economy.